All right, what's going on, everybody? It's Jonathyn, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Gaven Kerr. I've been trying to follow his stuff on YouTube and his books and things like that recently because I had never heard of him until I got it, and I hadn't heard a lot about these Catholic philosophers and theologians until I went on YouTube. YouTube's been exposing Catholics and non-Catholic Christians to another side of philosophy, and theology that they might not have seen before just by, watching William Lane Craig or something. So I'll just like Gaven, if you want to introduce yourself and tell us what your work is about and what your focus is, things like that.
Yeah, no problem. Well, listen, thanks very much for having me on. And I already apologized to Jonathyn before the show about the mix-up last week. Unfortunately, we had to cancel last week because there was a bit of a family emergency. And so at the last minute, I had to email Jonathyn and pull out. But, he was a great sport about it. And, we rearranged for this evening. So those of you who came back this evening, thank you. I apologize for last week. But anyway, so myself, so I'm Gaven. So I'm a philosopher. I've got a doctorate in philosophy. I'm from Ireland. More specifically, I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland, although I work in the south of Ireland in a place called Maynooth, where we have St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, which has quite a prestigious history as a college on the island of Ireland. So I teach philosophy at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. It's a pontifical institution. I'm 38 years old. I was born in the 80s, one of the greatest decades for music and TV, movies known to man. And I went to Queen's University in Belfast. I did my undergraduate degree there, started in 2001, graduated in 2004. And I did it in philosophy and scholastic philosophy. So the philosophy they did at Queen's, it was divided into a department of philosophy, which was by and large analytic philosophy, and a department of scholastic philosophy, which was, your traditional sort of Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and then contemporary scholastics. So I did a joint degree, which had both jointly dedicated to both subjects. After that, I was planning actually on moving to a different institution to do my master's, but a very important, famous at the time, philosopher by the name of James McAvoy, another Irishman, who had taught in Germany, he had taught in Belgium, and he had taught in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, where I am now. He came back to Belfast, Queen's University, Belfast, and so I undertook to do a research master's with him, and I did my research master's on the distinction between essence and existence in the thought of Aquinas. And then after I finished that in 2006, I did a doctorate with him, and the doctorate was on Aquinas' Metaphysics and Thomistic realism, which was really pitting Aquinas against Kant on epistemological issues. After that, I graduated in 2011. My supervisor, Jim McAvoy, Father McAvoy, he passed away that previous winter in October, on the Feast of the Angels, actually, in early October. And so he passed away before I submitted my doctorate, and my doctorate was actually submitted the day of his funeral. And it was examined on January 28th by John Haldane and another examiner here in Ireland on the Feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, January 28th. And then I graduated that July 2011. There was a bit of a need at Queen's University Belfast for some people to do some teaching in scholastic philosophy, given that Professor McAvoy had died and other people had sort of left. So there was a bit of an opening there. So I adjuncted for several years, teaching modules on scholastic philosophy, taking seminars on scholastic philosophy, as well as on Kant and other introduction to philosophy courses. Then later on, I got a position at Maynooth University, which is not the Pontifical Institute where I'm currently in, but it's a sister institute, which sort of broke away from the Pontifical Institute. I got a position there for a year, and then later afterwards, I got a position at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, teaching philosophy, which is where I'm at now. My work really has been focused on, it's common to be focused on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's is what's been attracting me these last number of years. But I also work in metaphysics more generally, and epistemology, in the history of philosophy, ancient, medieval, and modern and contemporary. on the thought of Immanuel Kant. And recently I've been getting into ethics, primarily because I have to teach ethics, but I also think the older I get, the more sort of reflection on life and life choices one has, that one starts to get a feel for different moves that can be made in ethical discussions. So I'm thinking at some point in the next few years, I might do a bit of more systematic research into ethics and maybe publish something in ethics. Publication-wise, I've published 2 books with Oxford University Press. The first one was Aquinas' Way to God, on Aquinas' proof for God's existence in the short treatise, De Ente Argument. The second one was on Aquinas and the metaphysics of creation. It was kind of a follow-up to my first book. So having established God's existence, what does that tell us about, creation and what that means? And other than that, I just, sort of publish, a lot of articles here and there on various issues in metaphysics, philosophical theology, epistemology, history of philosophy that interest me. I've got a number of articles forthcoming in the next year or so on Aquinas' first way, on Aquinas' fourth way. I've got an article already out on existential inertia. I'm sure if I pulled up the CV, there's a list of other ones that I've got listed. And I'm working on a book at the minute on Aquinas' classical theism. The words are really sort of getting up on that now. So after, June is the busy period for getting everything, squared off at college, and all the marks in. And once that's done, you can really sort of hit the ground running with research. So research on that book has really been picking up, and I'm up to about 40,000 words at the minute, which surprised me, but I'm happy about that. So working on that book on classical theism, and I've also been contracted by Catholic Answers to write an introductory sort of layman's text on Aquinas' 5 ways, which I'm co-authoring with Pat Flynn. So that's everything about me, anyway. I'm also married with 3 children, my greatest achievement. So I've been married since 2005. I've been with my wife since 1999, so 22 years now. So I was just a week away from my 16th birthday when I met my wife, and we got married then in 2005. And yeah, we have 3 wonderful children, and life is awesome.
That's beautiful. Just hearing you go through it was amazing. And you mentioned like scholastic philosophy, but also kind of engaging more contemporary philosophy. And I guess this is kind of a personal question that I just had is, it seems like there's an attitude in contemporary analytic philosophy from many analytic philosophers, kind of just hand-waving Thomas Aquinas, hand-waving Scotus, hand-waving Thomistic, any sort of Thomistic or broadly scholastic, or even Aristotelian philosophy. Do you think do you think that's true? And if so, what do you think maybe are the reasons for that, if you were to kind of think about it?
Yeah. So analytic philosophy, it's an interesting phenomenon. Nobody really knows what it is. And you speak to analytic philosophers and they don't really know what it is. It's kind of like, Augustine in Book 11 of the Confessions, when he's talking about time. And he says, look, well, what is time? Well, look, if you don't ask me, I know what it is, but if you ask me, I'm going to have trouble trying to explain it. You ask a different analytic philosopher what an analytic philosophy is, and they'll give you a different answer. There are a number of paradigm analytic philosophers. The logical positivists, certainly, they fall within that category. Frege is definitely an analytic philosopher, and it seems to have come on in waves in the 20th century. Arguably, we could say that Frege is, the originator of analytic philosophy, or that analytic philosophy is at least present there in Frege from the start, because it's really with Frege and Husserl and those 2 different ways of doing philosophy that you get that division between analytic philosophy and phenomenological philosophy. And this seems to be a reaction to German idealism. Where do we go with German idealism in the 19th century? We've had Kant, we've had all the neo-Kantians, we've had Hegel. So where do we go from there? And, Frege and Husserl seem to go 2 different directions. Dummett has a great book on this, The Origins of Analytic Philosophy. Not the origins, the origins is in the fruit, but the origins, the beginnings of analytic philosophy. He's got a great book on that. Very, very difficult to read, but it is a great book. And the first wave seemed to focus on analyze the analysis of language and the logical nature of language to resolve tricky issues in philosophy. And paradigmatically, the tricky issues in philosophy pertain to knowledge and to how we refer to things in the world. Okay. Bertrand Russell's paper on denoting, where he outlines his theory of descriptions, as a classic in this regard. How is it that we can have reference to things of which we don't have acquaintance, or things which in principle we can never have acquaintance, i.e. things which don't exist? And so this is where you get knowledge by descriptions. And that seems to have represented the first wave. Part of that first wave also, or maybe an offshoot from that first wave, is the philosophy of the logical positivists, who had a real sort of programmatic attitude to philosophy, because for the logical positivists, they wanted to demarcate a criterion of meaning by which we could evaluate, before we even evaluate the truth of philosophical statements, we want to evaluate whether or not philosophical statements are meaningful. And so they devised this criterion of meaning, by which you could just evaluate whether or not something was nonsense. And so they held, on the basis of their verification principle, which more or less stated that a statement is meaningful if it is logically analytic or empirically verifiable. And this was put forward in a lot of different ways. A.J. Eyre in Language, Truth and Logic, the latest edition of Language, Truth and Logic, there's an appendix to it where he goes through the different ways of, developing the verification principle. But it really requires that a statement has to be logically analytic or empirically verifiable. And so that means because the statements of metaphysics and a lot of the statements of philosophy, ethics included, they just don't meet that criterion. They can't even be evaluated for their truth or falsity. They just have to be rejected as meaningless. So famously, Carnap stated that that metaphysicians are like musicians without talent. They're led by, kind of their passions and their desires, and they dress that up in fancy, intelligent language. But whereas musicians know that what they're doing doesn't convey truth, on Carnap's view, it doesn't convey the truth of anything. It really just tries to get the listener into an emotional state. Musicians have talent because they know how to do that. Metaphysicians think they're doing philosophy, but they're not really doing that. They're just trying to get the readers into an emotional state. So they don't actually have the talent to do that because they're not sufficiently reflective enough to do that. And that was sort of the logical positivist wave of analytic philosophy. But along came one of the followers of Carnap, Willard Van Orman Quine, and he wrote a really famous paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And in that, he pointed out that the distinction between analyticity and the analytic synthetic distinction is ill-founded. So there isn't this clear dichotomy between analytic synthetic statements, in which case there's not a clear dichotomy between statements which are meaningful on the basis of being analytic and statements which are meaningful on the basis of being verifiable by experience, i.e. synthetic statements. And then the second dogma of empiricism, and arguably the more important one, but he gives it very little time in the article, is the view that scientific statements are verified individually. He holds that that's a dogma. Rather, scientific statements are verified within the context of an entire theory. So it's a theory which is verified as a whole and not individual statements. And that really undermined the project of the logical positivists. And then this signified a new wave in analytic philosophy. Also around this time, there was a movement in analytic philosophy called, ordinary language philosophy, which didn't look to the logical analysis of language, but looked at ordinary language as, helping us resolve philosophical issues. And, the later Wittgenstein played a big role in that. And sort of around the time of the mid-20th century, the Kantian influence came back into analytic philosophy, especially with the work of Wilfrid Sellars, Peter Strawson, and then the Pittsburgh School later on, many of which are still alive today, who have brought Hegel back into analytic philosophy. That's a kind of a perceive of what analytic philosophy is. But now to your question about this hand waving and this dismissiveness of, scholasticism and even Aristotelianism, certainly the early waves of analytic philosophy were very dismissive of all traditional philosophy, really, including Kant. If there were any philosopher in the canon that they would have looked up to, perhaps it would have been Hume, David Hume. But the dismissiveness was that these philosophers within the tradition hadn't sufficiently reflected on the analysis of language and how language can be used to dissolve problems which were seen to be problematic in the first place. They could easily be resolved if we just engaged in a logical analysis of language. So basically, in their attitude, and now I'm generalizing here, in their attitude, It's not a question of valuing or disvaluing, scholastic philosophy or ancient philosophy. There just was no philosophy being done then, at least no good philosophy being done. Then when, ordinary language philosophy came back in and the Kantian sort of influences came back in, there was a realization that, Aristotle had something interesting to say about knowledge and the nature of knowledge, and that some of the scholastics had something interesting to say here. And so, and indeed, there was an engagement of the neo-Thomists and the neo-scholastics in the early 20th century with, the Kantian philosophers pointing out that Aquinas and Kant, engage in a lot of the same sort of philosophizing, and they can be brought into conversation with each other. But, and this is the crucial sort of turning point, I think, in 20th century analytic philosophy. There was the return of the metaphysicians. The metaphysicians returned to analytic philosophy. Gilson, the famous history of scholastic philosophy and historian of philosophy, pointed out that metaphysics buries its undertakers. That the students of the analytic philosophers who had rejected metaphysics, their followers, okay, and they had come back and they had rediscovered metaphysics, and they brought metaphysics back into analytic philosophy. They made metaphysics respectable again. And there was two ways of doing metaphysics. There was Quine, who held that the way we do metaphysics is we consider what there is. In other words, we take our most respectable discourse about reality, which is natural science and mathematics for Quine. We regiment it within the logic of first order predicate logic, and we ask ourselves, given this regimentation of the language of natural science, let's say, what must exist in order for the statements in natural science to be true? That's our ontology. If we know what exists in order for those statements in natural science and mathematics to be true, that's what our ontology is. And that's one way of doing metaphysics. But then Saul Kripke and Alvin Plantinga, okay, they engaged with the issue of the truths of our modal statements. Okay, so how do we account for the truths of the statements that, Nixon was the president of the United States, but he may not have been the president of the United States, yet he may not have never been Nixon. All right. So Nixon is necessarily himself. He's Nixon, but he's only contingently, or he only was contingently, the president of the United States. In some other possible world, he, could have been something else. And sort of Kripke points out that, if we ask about all the worlds in which Nixon exists, there are various properties that he has which designate him rigidly as Nixon, but there are other properties that he has which don't designate him rigidly. He only has them in some of the worlds in which he exists. He doesn't have them in all of the worlds in which he exists. Those properties which designate Nixon rigidly, those are Nixon's necessary properties, and they're essential to him. So Nixon is essentially Nixon. Nixon is essentially constituted out of the matter of which he's constituted. Nixon essentially originates from the progenitors from which he originates. That's the essentiality of origins, essentiality of identity, and the essentiality of constitution thesis that Kripke brings out. And this was in a book by Kripke called Naming and Necessity. Alvin Plantinga does something similar. And what do we have there? We have essentialism. We have a commitment to the fact that things have essential properties. And it was pointed out that this idea that individuals have essential properties which designates them as individuals is not too far away from the view of John Duns Scotus, that forms of things, you have quantitative forms of things that make things what they are, but you also have haikaities, forms which signify this, the formal element of what it is to be this individual, such as Nixon's essential properties that he has. And so the connection with Scotus there wasn't missed, and that sort of opened up an engagement then with scholastic philosophy. But what, certainly from my point of view, what I have noticed is that within analytic philosophy and the general discussion of it, there's an appropriation of certain themes within our big major scholastic philosophers such as Aquinas and Scotus and others, but it's outside of the context and the framework in which they did this. And I'm thinking primarily of Aquinas in this respect, that Aquinas, when he talks about modality, he doesn't do so in terms of possible worlds, and indeed, his position can't be understood in terms of possible worlds. When he talks about existence, there's no analytic philosophical account of existence, which captures Aquinas's view of existence, and a number of other things. And so what I find the analytic philosophers doing when they engage with the scholastic philosophers, they're picking this and that from the scholastic philosophers outside of the context in which it was intelligible within the scholastic philosophers. So they keep these sorts of views and themes in name only, but they've lost the significance that they had for the scholastic philosophers themselves. And in general, I found whenever I've engaged with analytical philosophers, not all of them, but with those, a number of those with whom I've engaged, a reluctance to think their way into a scholastic way of thinking. The standard has always been that a scholastic has to translate his or her position into an analytical way of thinking, whatever that is. Whereas the analytic, is sort of resistant to thinking his or her way into a scholastic non-analytic way of thinking. And this is an argument I made a number of years ago in an article on Thomist essay and analytical philosophy. So there does tend to be some hand waving in analytical philosophy. And I think that's because, there's not been enough historical distance from the origins of analytical philosophy to practitioners of analytical philosophy now, whereby they can't look back on the movement and see it as a movement as a whole. Whereas with scholasticism, we can, look back on it and see it as a movement of a whole, and we can say what is scholastic and what isn't scholastic. Analytical philosophy is more of a feeling that this is analytical philosophy, and it doesn't really have any sort of doctrinal commitments to it. So let's say, if I'm an analytical philosopher and I don't feel this scholastic philosophy makes any sense, I'm going to try to retranslate it outside the context of scholastic philosophy. And that's kind of how I read the developments in analytical philosophy. I don't think analytical philosophy is the be all and end all of philosophy. And I would like to hope that analytical philosophy will become more porous to other philosophical traditions, even other contemporary philosophical traditions.
And I think, not to cut you off, but I actually think you have seen you have seen a lot of philosophers like Rob Koons, for example, kind of bringing back Thomistic metaphysics and trying to apply it to like modern science, like with quantum mechanics. And also, I know there's Jeffrey Brower and Michael Rea have because there's obviously also non-scholastic Christians using an analogy with form and matter to describe the role of like how the Trinity works, right? Like they're numerically the same God, but they're, and whether we agree with that account or not, they're using the scholastic concepts to kind of make sense of our, philosophy or of our theology and our shared theology with Protestants too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it brings up another point for me, which is an important one, and it's that I don't really like working within, the context or the confines of a philosophical tradition. To my mind, there's just philosophy. And if somebody wants to come along and identify the philosophy that you do as scholastic or as this or that kind of ism, fair enough. But for me, what's important is we have to engage with the individual philosopher himself or herself, rather than the ism. So the only ism I would sort of say that we could recognize would be, an ism named after a particular thinker, Thomism, Scotism, Aristotelianism. And that's because we have the texts themselves that we can go to concrete and see what's, that person.
Scholasticism is a very umbrella term, different scholastic views.
Yeah. And analytic philosophy as well. It just incorporates so many, different, mutually inconsistent views. So it's hard to see, especially with analytical philosophy, what falls under its banner. Even when we get to sort of isms like realism, idealism, skepticism, essentialism, I get a wee bit sort of nervous because I'm kind of like, okay, which realism, whose realism are we talking about? So my approach is to tend to just stay away from those categorizations unless you want to say Thomism or something like that, then just do philosophy and then somebody else can,
just examine what the thinkers thought.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I appreciate the answer because it was very in depth. And I think, I think actually Oderberg his name is always hard for me to pronounce, but he has a book called Real Essentialism, which I still have to read through. And he kind of criticizes that, development in modal logic, from what I understand, where they categorize, where it's kind of, they have it in the reverse, like the essence of a thing determines if it's necessary or contingent, rather than it existing in all possible worlds determines whether it's necessary or contingent. It's like the reversing the order of operations.
Gyula Klima, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Gyula Klima. He's at Fordham. He made the same point with regard to Thomistic essentialism and contemporary essentialism, and I repeated it in my 2015 book that for the Thomist, at least, or the real essentialist, if you want to know the essential properties of the thing, look at the thing and look at the thing's essence. And once you look at the thing's essence, then we can read off its essential properties, instead of looking at its essential properties and the possible worlds and then figuring out its essence in the actual world.
Yeah, because the essence, from what I understand, is, and this is going to get into my next question about, or a further question about essence and existence and the De Ente, is it seems like essence because some people want to say essences are just bundles of properties and attributes, but from what I understand, that's not actually the Thomistic view. It's rather that the essence, the properties flow from the essence of a thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it. So a thing has properties in virtue of having an essence. The essence of the thing is just what the thing is, and so it's signified by its definitional content. So if we can get the real definition of the thing, we have the essence of the thing. So the essence of a human being is rational animality. That's what a thing is. That's the thing's essence, and so that involves its form, but also its matter as well, because a human being is a material thing. So its matter has to be included in its definition. So rational animality is what a human being is. And in virtue of being a rational animal, a human being has certain properties.
Yeah, and when I read the De Ente, I mean, that seems like it's straight from Aquinas and the De Ente that, about the nature of essences. Could you maybe lay out for people who don't know the historical context of the De Ente, why Aquinas is writing this and what he's trying to do in the De Ente? Because it's not a very well-known work. Most people just know about the Summa, basically.
Yeah. Okay, that's no problem. So for anybody who doesn't know the De Ente of Aquinas, I would say if you want to read a very short work, which will just get you into Aquinas's metaphysics, the De Ente et Essentia is probably the best one to read. After that, read the De Principiis Naturae, on the principles of nature. Again, very, very short work, and it will just lay out for you Aquinas's metaphysical thought. It's one of those wee philosophical gems in the history of philosophy that you could just read within an afternoon. You could literally read it within a few hours. It's like Descartes' Meditations or David Hume's Inquiries or Plato's Phaedo, something like that. You could just sit down and read it in a few hours, and it's very easy to read. It's demanding, but straightforward. It's not like reading Aristotle's Metaphysics or Kant's Critique. So the historical context of the De Ente is Aquinas wrote it when he was studying to be a Master of Theology at the University of Paris, which was basically, he was a PhD student at the University of Paris. And he was living, he was a Dominican, and he was living at the Dominican house at Saint-Jacques in Paris. And some of the other younger Dominicans who were doing their philosophy, they just couldn't understand metaphysics. So Brother Thomas writes this treatise on metaphysics to help them out. And you can really see that it is, this very simple sort of text, just laying out the nature of being and essence and things. And so the first chapter just lays out, being and essence in general. The next two chapters look at the essences of composite things, so things which are composed. The fourth chapter looks at the essence of simple things. And then the fifth chapter just closes things off by considering essence and accidents and a number of other issues. And so what Thomas is doing there, he's putting forth his own philosophical program, but he roots it within the tradition of Aristotle and Avicenna. So Avicenna is an important, the Islamic philosopher Avicenna is an important influence on him here. And on a number of crucial issues, he sides with Avicenna against the other major Islamic philosopher known as the commentator called Averroes, and in particular with essence. He sides against Averroes to a certain extent with Avicenna, but you see his own. Should I get into that, Jonathyn, or do you have any queries?
Sorry, you cut out there. Can you just repeat the last sentence, the last thing you just said? You cut out.
Yeah, sorry. So when it comes to essence, you see Aquinas, sort of move away from the Averroistic view of essence and more perhaps towards the Avicennian view, but certainly more towards his own formulating his own view of essence within the context of his own metaphysics, which is beginning to emerge. So, would you like to?
That's actually right where I wanted to go, kind of in the realm of distinguishing his view on essence and existence from other views. Specifically, I'm thinking mine about like the Platonic kind of view of essence that you still kind of have in contemporary analytic philosophy, and then a kind of nominalism or anti-realism about essences might be the better category, and then a kind of maybe conceptualism where they're just thoughts in our head. Like where does Aquinas's view fit into that picture, if at all?
Yeah. So the essence, so the Platonic view then is that, you have these forms or ideas, and they're separate and immaterial, and they are the essence, the measure, and the cause of the things that participate in them. Okay, so usually the way I try to help my students think about this when first introducing them to it, and I really hope I'm not patronizing any of your listeners, but just for anybody who doesn't really know an awful lot about Plato, the example I give is the meter stick at Paris. So the standard meter, French meter, mètre means measure. The standard meter is at Paris. Okay, it's the standard meter. Everything is a meter because it is equal in length to that meter at Paris. Okay, that is the measure by which anything else then is designated a meter, and that's something like the role that form plays in Plato's thought. Although there are important differences as well, but it gives you the general idea that the form of the thing is the means and the measure by which the thing is the thing that it is. So for Plato, I'm a man and you're a man and all human beings are human beings because we participate in the form of humanity. The form of humanity is the measure by means of which we are the human beings that we are. So that's the Platonic view. Forms are real, they're universal, they're outside of the mind, and they're also outside of the things whose forms they are. Now, Aristotle had a different view. Aristotle held that forms are in the thing. Classic example that he gives is that of a statue. So you have, I like to use the example of the statue of David. You have the statue of David. It's made out of marble. That's the stuff. That's the matter out of which it's made. But that stuff takes on a certain form, the shape of the statue of David, making it a statue of David, as opposed to a statue of something else, the Pieta or whatever. The form is multiply realizable. You can have lots of different statues of David, but they're all of the same form because they all, have the same sort of shape to them. They're different because that form is realized in different chunks of matter. So for Aristotle, then, the form is in the thing. You take away the thing, you take away the form. Whereas for Plato, the form isn't in the thing. Things participate in the form. You take away the thing, the form can still remain. Now, what was Aquinas' view? Well, he undoubtedly sides with Aristotle in this case, that for Aquinas, the form is in the thing. So he thinks that the Platonists have confused the mode in which the form exists in the intellect as universal and separate, and the mode in which the form exists in reality as concrete in particular. So he certainly agrees with Aristotle when it comes to form, but when it comes to essence, this is something different, because there's a bit of a, sort of debate in Aristotelian philosophy as to whether or not the essence of the thing is just the form by itself or the composite union of matter and form. Now, Averroes held, and this is arguably the historical Aristotle's view, Averroes held that for Aristotle, essence and form are synonymous. The form is the essence of the thing. But Thomas holds that the essence of the thing is the composite unity of its matter and form, signified by the definitional content, that essence has to include the matter of the thing because that's no less essential to the thing than its form. And you see sneaking in here Aquinas' own metaphysics of essence and existence, because if the essence of the thing is whatever is subject to the act of existence, then that has to include not only the form but also the matter that the form informs. So for Aquinas, essence is the composite unity of matter and form, signified by the definitional content. And that's Aquinas' own position coming in there. But now you asked me about realism, nominalism, conceptualism. For Aquinas, the essence of the substance is real. Okay, so the substance is the thing, and it has an essence. It's the kind of substance that it is because of its essence. So he's a realist in that respect, but he's a moderate realist, because the essence exists individually in the thing. The substance supposits for the essence for humanity. So I'm an individual instance of humanity, as are you, as are all your listeners. I'm assuming we're all human. Maybe some people have cats and dogs listening, but they're not rational, so they can't make sense of this. So I think I might get annihilated in the comments for that one, saying that the cats
probably.
and dogs aren't rational. Yeah, well, at least maybe cats are rational because they're demonic, and demons are rational.
Yeah.
But anyway, dogs are angelic. They could be rational. There you go. Right. So anyway, so Aquinas holds that individuals supposit for the nature that they have. So we are all individual instances of humanity, but no one of us is humanity itself. Okay. But humanity doesn't exist floating about there in a Platonic sort of sense. It only exists sort of universally or in a general sense in our minds thinking about it. So humanity only, so the essence only exists in itself. In itself, it's universal, but it only exists in itself in our minds. In reality, it exists individually in the thing. So he's a moderate realist. Okay, now nominalism, conceptualism, there's not really much that divides them, those two views. So those views are that, the essences or the forms of things, universal features of things by which we designate them as the things that they are constructs of our thinking, or they are ways in which we refer to things, nomina, hence nominalism. It's the way in which we label things, but they're not features of the things themselves. Okay, they're features of kind of how we relate ourselves to things. Now Aquinas does not hold that position, so he's an epistemic realist. That we can know we can know the essences of real things, and sort of formulate those and represent those to ourselves. And there are reasons for Aquinas being a moderate realist, an epistemic realist of that type, as opposed to a nominalist or a conceptualist.
So I think, and this transfers over to universals as well, because essences and universals are kind of tied, if I'm understanding that. Yeah. And so if I'm understanding correctly, moderate realism, I've always understood it to be, obviously, like you said, like the essence of humanity really does exist in me and you, in some sense have the same humanity, but in another sense, we don't have the same humanity. The universality of an essence is kind of the mind abstracting from the particulars. And then the essences also exist in the things as individual. Yeah. And I think that's kind of, because I read through the De Ente, and if I'm not mistaken, I might have to reread it. One of his critiques of the Platonic view is that you can't really give it doesn't really give a good account of the particularity of the essences. It's just kind of universal, but it doesn't capture the particularity, which I think is probably what Plato wanted to capture: the particularity, the one and the many.
Yeah. And that's the standard Aristotelian critique of Plato. Now, historically speaking, the argument is made that, Aristotle read Plato in a very Aristotelian fashion and criticized Plato in that fashion. So historically, whether or not the historical Plato might have been able to come back at Aristotle is a different matter. But at least that's the standard Aristotelian critique of Plato, that it just doesn't do the job of, dealing with the particularity of particular things.
And I think also it gets you, and I've thought about this and I want to hear what you think, is if we can make good arguments to, like, say, an atheist for moderate realism about essences, you might be able to make a sort of argument for a divine intellect, because if the essences only really exist in the particular things and in a intellect that, like, abstracting them, then prior to humans, though, we would still say that the human essence exists in some sense, but obviously there's no particular humans and there's no Platonic world of forms, so there has to be a kind of intellect that has these essences in it. Do you kind of see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I see where you're getting at. Do you want my thoughts on that, or?
Yeah. If you think that that's like a way you could maybe approach the conversation with an atheist who might accept moderate realism.
Yeah, I certainly think that good reasons can be put forth for moderate, epistemic realism, that, we can grasp the essences of things, as they are, in the thing itself. So we can see the world as thus and so, and seeing the world as thus and so does not involve our conceptual capacities imposing structure or constructing the world as thus and so. I certainly think that argument can be made. I'm not so sure about making the argument that that would point to some sort of divine intellect in which the essences of the things which don't currently exist or will exist in the future or which could exist are present. And this is because I think at that point of the conversation, it is still an open case. One could easily just say that, the essence of thing is just how the material thing itself is structured here and now, and not as a result of physical laws and evolutionary processes, and there need not be appeal to a divine intellect at that point to explain that. Now, I do think that we have good reasons for thinking that a primary cause of all things exists, which is a creator, and that the creator creates by means of intelligence. So I do think there is a divine intellect which knows all the the essences of all possible things. But I just don't think reflecting on epistemic realism is the way to get us to that intellect.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that because I'd been thinking about it and how Aquinas's picture of essences fits into a sort of argument, and almost an Augustinian argument is what Ed Feser kind of refers to it as, for the existence of God.
Yeah, I would be reluctant to follow that sort of argument, and from what I know of Thomas, I don't think Thomas would be a fan of that sort of argumentation either.
Okay, yeah. Now we talked a lot about essence, but existence seems harder to define. But maybe give your best, because I'm sure you have like the best explanation there is of this. Like, what exactly is existence? As best as we can, because it's a very primitive term.
So existence is the correlative principle of actuality to essence. So Aquinas famously in the De Ente Essentia, chapter 4, he argues that there's a distinction between essence and existence in all things which are capable of being multiplied. And we can get into all that argumentation if you like. But his point is that in things in which essence and existence are distinct, the essence stands in potency to its active existence, without which it would not be. So existence is the correlative principle of actuality to essence as a correlative principle of potency. So it's what actuates the essence, and it makes it real, makes the thing a being in the world.
Right, and maybe I think it's I can't pronounce the term, but maybe you could give the argument about the distinction between essence and existence that Aquinas gives with the example of the three objects, and when you conceptualize them, you don't know about their existence. So kind of what is that argument? And if you could pronounce it for me, because I actually forget how to pronounce it. Yeah.
So in chapter 4, so Aquinas, he rejects a position known as universal hylomorphism. So the issue here is, what is the ultimate principle of potency? Okay. And in Aristotelian metaphysics, matter seems to be the principle of potency. And this raises an issue. Well, what about, it's certainly plausible that there could be immaterial things which are not God. They're not pure actuality, that are creatures. And obviously in Christian theology, the angels are creatures, but they're not identical to God. In Aristotelian, sort of physics, you got these separated substances which move the heavens. But the point is that, look, we can at least countenance that there could be immaterial creatures, and as such, they don't exist in virtue of what they are. They don't exist essentially. So how do we account for their potency? And universal hylomorphism held that everything which has any element of potency is material. And so we distinguish between corporeal matter, which is the bodily things that we see, and incorporeal matter. And immaterial creatures have incorporeal matter. Now, Aquinas rejects this position. He rejects it as ad hoc. It misses the very nature of separate immaterial substances. We need to think our way through the issue at a more fundamental level. And he says that although immaterial creatures would not have matter, they would still have an element of potency, and this is their potentiality to exist. And in order to establish that they have a potentiality to exist, that there's potency in them to their existence, we have to establish that there's a distinction between essence and existence in things. And so he sets out 3 stages of argumentation. The first 2 stages of argumentation provide argumentation for a real distinction between essence and existence. And what we mean by a real distinction is that in real things, there's a distinction between their essence and their existence. They're non-identical to each other. That doesn't mean that they're separate. Okay, that doesn't mean separation. It just means distinction. In the same way that the matter and the form of a statue are not separated from each other, but are distinct in the statue, so too essence and existence are distinct from each other, though not separated from each other. For if they were separated, you wouldn't have the thing in question. So the first argument then, the one I think you're referring to, which has the Latin title, it's called the Intellectus Essentiae argument. It's the understanding of essences argument. That's the one you were thinking of?
Yeah, exactly.
So that means the understanding of essences argument, and it is labeled the Intellectus Essentiae argument because it begins by a consideration of how we understand the essences of things. So Aquinas argues that whatever enters into the whatever doesn't enter into the understanding of an essence or quiddity is distinct from the essence and composed with it from without. Because in order to understand the essence of a thing, we need to understand the parts of the essence. So when I understand the essence of human, I understand rational animality. That's what it is to be human. Okay, so whenever we have to understand the essence of something, we need to understand its parts. Now, we can understand the essence of things, the essences of things, without understanding their existence. For example, I can understand what it is. I can understand the essence of a phoenix or the essence of a man, but that doesn't mean I've grasped the existence of a phoenix or of a man. So what's the essence of a phoenix? It's a bird that rises, after, from the fire of its own death. The essence of a man is rational animality. Just because you understand that doesn't mean that any phoenixes or any men exist. Therefore, essence and existence are distinct in things unless there's something whose essence is identical to its existence. And that's the first stage of argumentation for distinction between essence and existence. And it's generated a whole lot of controversy as to what Aquinas intends with that argument.
Right, because I've heard some people try to argue that some Thomistic thinkers try to argue that he's really not making a real distinction, but he's making a kind of logical distinction between essence and existence. And I've heard critics saying that even if you accept that you could know the essence of a phoenix without knowing that it exists, that that doesn't actually get you to the claim that they're really distinct. And what would be the general responses to those criticisms, or those two general types of criticisms?
Yeah. So I'm one of those Thomists who hold that Thomas isn't intending to establish a real distinction at that first stage of argumentation. So I argue that Thomas is focused on our understanding of essence. He's not focusing on the essences, which are understood. He's focusing on how we understand the essences of things. And so what he's distinguishing are the different conceptual acts or cognitional activities by which we understand the thing's essence and by which we understand the thing's existence. Okay, so he's pointing out a distinction in our cognitional operations. That doesn't mean that essence and existence in the thing are actually distinct, because things can be distinct in our thinking of them, but they can be identical in the thing. For example, the morning star and the evening star both signify, different meanings. So the morning star is the last star you see in the morning. Evening star is first star you see in the evening, but they're one and the same thing. They're the planet Venus. So that's the sort of the way I take that first stage of argumentation. Now, others have argued that, no, Aquinas is actually focused on the essences of things that exist. And insofar as he's focused on the essences of things that exist, he's arguing that the essences of the things that exist bring into operation certain conceptual episodes distinct from the conceptual episodes that the existence of things bring into operation. And given, that the real essences of things that exist bring into operation certain conceptual episodes non-identical to the conceptual episodes brought into operation when the existence of the thing is focused on, the essence and existence of the actual thing are distinct. And so Anthony Kenny, even though he's not sympathetic in any way whatsoever to this kind of thinking, Anthony Kenny, he holds that that's what Thomas is doing in that first stage. And recently Ed Feezer, he holds that, Aquinas is doing this sort of thing in the first stage. I haven't really sort of engaged an awful lot with Ed Feezer's reasoning on this, but it's something along the lines of, if I make a mistake about a thing's existence, it doesn't mean that I've made a mistake about a thing's essence. So if I, talk about, let's say, a human, as a rational animal, and I just say that, humans don't exist, I'm just wrong to say that humans don't exist, but it doesn't mean that I've, made a mistake in understanding the essence of the thing. So that's enough to indicate that essence and existence are distinct. I think, that's an interesting mode of reasoning. I just don't think that's what Thomas is doing in that first stage of argumentation. I think he's focused on how we understand things.
So it's more of an interpretive question about how we interpret that particular passage in Aquinas.
Yeah,
with that argument.
Yeah, and it's funny. In his review of my 2015 book, Fieser says, he's very, very, very complimentary and everything, but he says there's one thing I disagree with Kerr on, and it's this. and he went to he got at me at that. But yeah, it's just an internal, argumentative thing. All Thomists agree that Thomas does intend and does seek to establish a real distinction at some point. It's just which point he does it.
Right.
Fieser and others hold that it's at this stage, at stage one. But there's a second stage of argumentation where I hold that it happens, and where I'm following John Whipple in this. Whipple holds that it happens as well. Now, we all hold that Thomas intends to establish a real distinction at some point. It's just which point he does establish it.
And what is that second stage of argumentation that gets into the real distinction in your understanding of Aquinas?
Yeah, this is brilliant. So, that last line of argumentation from this first stage, so essence and existence are distinct unless there is something in which essence and existence, unless there is something whose essence is its existence. So if there's something obviously whose essence is its existence, essence and existence will not be distinct in that. And Aquinas then, he moves into stage two and he says, let's just consider hypothetically this thing whose essence is its existence. We're not saying it exists, but let's just consider it. What would it be like? And Aquinas argues, well, it would be subsistent existence because it would exist in virtue of what it is. It would just be pure existence itself. And Aquinas argues, well, given that, it could only be one and unique. Subsistent existence could only be one and unique. There could, in principle, not be more than one subsistent existent. And this is clear, Aquinas argues, when we consider the different modes of multiplication. So he sets out three different modes of multiplication. The first mode of multiplication is as a genus is multiplied into its species through the addition of some difference. So you take the genus animal and the species human. What multiplies animality into the species humanity? Well, it's with the addition of rationality. Rationality is outside the genus, and it's added to the genus to specify it and produce humans. The same happens with other species of animals. And so that's one mode of multiplication. Another mode of multiplication is as species are multiplied in individuals. So the species human is multiplied into the individuals, Peter, James, and John, through the addition of matter. So humanity is realized in those distinct chunks of matter that Peter, James, and John have. And then the third mode of multiplication is very Platonic, is when you have something separate and absolute in which things participate. So, for example, the light of the sun is multiplied in the individuals that participate in the light of the sun. Or if you had some separated fire, that everybody comes to light their fires at, that fire would be multiplied. Now, Aquinas considers the first two forms of multiplication, and he holds that something that is pure existence itself couldn't be multiplied in those two modes. He doesn't consider the third one. And the reason why he doesn't consider the third one is when you think about it, what's separate and absolute isn't actually multiplied through being participated in. The participants are already multiple, and they simply enjoy, whatever it is that's separate and absolute, such as, let's say, the heat of the fire, the light of the sun. When the light of the sun is received, in distinct things on the earth and they participate in it, you don't have, you got 6 billion people on the earth, enjoying the light of the sun. That doesn't mean you have 6 billion suns. So what's separate and absolute isn't actually multiplied through being participated in. But Thomas considers the first two. And he holds that what's pure existence itself couldn't be multiplied in either of those ways. So consider the first one. As a genus is multiplied into its species by the addition of some differentiating feature. The differentiating feature has to be outside of the genus, and it goes to specify it. Now, this hypothetical being we're considering is pure existence itself. As pure existence, there is nothing outside of it which it does not cause. So there's nothing outside of it to which it is subjected for multiplication. So outside of the genus, you have rationality to which the genus is subjected to be multiplied into various species. So you have various specifications of the genus. But this hypothetical being is pure existence itself. So there's nothing outside of it to which it could be subjected, which would multiply it in any way. So it can't be multiplied in that first sense. It can't be specified in that first sort of sense. Well, what about the second sense? As you have individual species as you have species multiplied into individuals through the addition of matter. Well, again, that would require the addition of something outside of the species, individual chunks of matter. And we've already seen that there's nothing outside of pure existence itself to which it could be subjected for multiplication. But not only that, let's say even if per impossibile, it could be multiplied into individuals, then it wouldn't subsist in virtue of what it is. It wouldn't be subsistent existence, because material things, it would thus be material existence, and material things don't subsist in virtue of what they are. They subsist in their matter and their material components. So I subsist in the matter, that I have at the minute. Once this matter loses its unity and starts falling apart, I'm dead. So my death coincides with, the destruction of this matter. So I cease to subsist without this matter. But something which is pure existence itself is subsistent existence, so it couldn't be multiplied materially. Now, just something to point out there is that if Thomas can go on and demonstrate that a primary cause of all things exists, which is pure existence itself, then given what we've seen so far, it couldn't be material. It couldn't be a material cause, so it has to be immaterial. So that's one thing to point out.
Because it would have no potency at all. It couldn't even have matter at all, because it has no potency in it at all. Would that be the...
Yeah, absolutely. And that leads to the next point here, which is that Thomas has considered and rejected two forms of multiplication, but are there any further forms of multiplication? And he doesn't address that. And I argue in my 2015 book is that the reason why he doesn't address that is clear. And it's as you say, if it's pure existence itself, it stands in potency to nothing. So it's subjected to nothing for multiplication. So there's no principle of multiplication to which it would stand in potency to be multiplied, given that it's pure existence itself. So in principle, it could not be multiplied, because anything which is multiplied has some kind of potency to it by which it is capable of being multiplied. So on that basis, Thomas argues that something which is pure existence is utterly unique. There could at most be one such thing. Now, that doesn't mean that it exists, but if it does exist, there could at most be one. And here's where the real distinction comes in, because all this is just building up to the real distinction between essence and existence. Because what Thomas reasons here is that if it is a truth about something whose essence is its existence, that it couldn't be multiplied in any way, that at most it could be one and unique, then anything that isn't one and unique, i.e. anything which is multiplied, isn't that thing, regardless of whether it exists. Anything which is multiplied is not something in which essence and existence are identical. So given now that we know that something whose essence and existence, something whose essence is its existence, could only be one and unique, then anything which is not one and unique, anything which is multiple, is not that. And if it's not that, if anything which is multiple is not something in which essence and existence are identical, anything which is multiple is something in which essence and existence are distinct. And given that we have real multiple beings, we have distinction of essence and existence in those multiple beings. And so that's where myself and John Whipple, we hold that Aquinas, in fact, establishes the real distinction.
Yeah, and basically, would another way of putting this be, say you have three apples. Those particular apples could not be each identical to the essence of apple, right? Because they're just, you kind of see what I'm saying is like because there's three apples, and so they're not identical to their appleness, because that appleness is shared. Yeah. So there has to be a real distinction between the principle of unity between the particular apples, namely the essence, and the active existence that each apple has. There has to be a distinction.
Yeah, a multiplication of existence is not a multiplication of essences.
Yeah, that for me is really that really seems convincing. What are some of the arguments? Are there any like major criticisms of that line of reasoning that you're aware of? That
really, the only sort of critical engagements I've had of that have come from, internal sort of, Thomist discussions that would maybe want to say that it's the first stage of argument rather than this stage where he wants to establish a real distinction. I suppose maybe the major sort of critique of that is Anthony Kenny, who holds that the idea of something whose essence is its existence is just, it's absurd, because on Phrygian principles, we just can't countenance something whose essence is its existence, because existence, on a Phrygian account is, it's not a property of things. It's a property of properties of things. So it's a second order predicate. And so Thomas is just confused what existence is. He's viewing existence here as something which is real and not just, a property of properties.
Yeah, it's the act of all acts, I think, is the. So it would really come down to a dispute over with Kenny. It would come over to a dispute about how we're thinking about existence. Yeah, and that's why that's why I argued in my Thomist essay paper and in chapter 3 of my book that Thomas's view of existence, or the Latin term essay, it really is sui generis, and you kind of have to think your way into it because it just is so primordial. You do just have to think your way into it and kind of come to terms with Thomas's thinking on your own. It's not going to be capturable, certainly not within a Phrygian framework, but even in a number of other analytical frameworks, you're just not going to come to terms with existence. The closest I've seen any sort of philosopher come to terms with what Aquinas means by existence is Heidegger. But in any case, what it comes down to is really just a fundamental metaphysical difference as to how we understand and interpret existence. Kenny, for his part, he sets out a Phrygian account of existence and then criticizes Aquinas for not being Phrygian enough in his thinking. And if you want, I think what I think is a systematic, refutation of Kenny's, little book Aquinas on Being. Dula Klima, again from Fordham, he wrote a review of it for the International Philosophical Quarterly, where I just think he went in and out through it, basically. Yeah, I'll have to read that.
Yeah, it really is excellent, and he just really. It was a book review, but it could have been a standalone article where he just went, really in depth, through Kenny's book on the matter.
So I think with Essence and Existence, I think the audience probably has a good picture of what Aquinas thought about essence and existence and the relationship, right? Essence stands to existence as potency to act.
Yeah.
And I think the other key part of this argument is the distinction between two types of causal series, right? The essentially ordered and accidentally ordered, or per se and per accident. So could you maybe explain the difference between those? Maybe give an example of each so people kind of know, because this is not something you'll hear a lot of modern theists bring up in arguments for God, these two types of series. Sure.
Yeah. So the context of this is that Thomas is wondering, look, things in which essence and existence are distinct, how do they get their existence? Okay, because existence is distinct from the essence, so it can't be that the essence generates, the existence of the thing, because prior to having existence, the thing doesn't exist with its essence to generate its existence. So it has to come from some extrinsic principle. So where does it come from? And this sets up a regress of causes. You have some extrinsic, principle, which is the cause of the existence of the thing, and this sets up, your regressive causes. And this prompts Thomas, not in the De Ente, but consistent with the De Ente reasoning. But elsewhere, Thomas distinguishes between these two kinds of causal series that you point out, the per se and the per accidens causal series. So good. Well, we'll start with examples of the two different types of causal series, and then we'll just break down the metaphysics of it. So an example of a per accidens causal series is a father produces a son, who produces a son, who produces a son, who produces a son, and so on and so on, and so back and so back. And so the chain, the links in the chain just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger indefinitely. And so that's a per accidens causal series. A per se causal series, the stock example is the mind or the mental agent moves his hand to move the stick, to move the stone. In the per accidens causal series, the fathers and sons series, the members of the series possess the causality of the series, essentially. So they have the causality of that series in virtue of what they are. Whereas the members of the per se causal series, the hand, the stick, and the stone, they have the causality of that series non-essentially. They don't possess the causality of that series essentially, and so they participate in something which does possess the causality of that series essentially. And we'll draw this out with regard to those examples. So let's take our fathers and sons example. The father produces a son who produces a son. So we have Peter, James, and John. Peter fathers James, and James fathers John. Peter is John's grandfather. James is John's father, and Peter is James's father. Kind of have to just get that straight in my head there, okay?
Yeah.
But you kind of get the general picture. Grandfather, father, son. All right. So what is the causality in that series? What is, the causal feature of the series? It's fatherhood. It's fathering. It's paternity. Okay. That's the causality which is going on in that series, and that's how that series is constituted as the causal series that it is. One man follows another man who follows another who follows another, and so on. So within the context of the causality of paternity, Peter is the cause of James because he's the father of James, but he is not the cause of John. He's not the cause of his grandson with respect to paternity. James is the cause of John, Peter's grandson. Okay, and this is borne out by the fact, first of all, that James doesn't need Peter's help to father John. Doesn't need anything from Peter to father John. James can do what needs to be done to father John without Peter being there. All right? And why is this? Because James is a fully functioning biological male who can father John, who can have his own offspring. Not only that, think about this. Let's say Peter fathers James. James is born. Wonderful. James's mother is in the hospital. She's recovering. So Peter thinks we'll go out and wet the baby's head. Now, in the Irish context, wetting the baby's head doesn't mean baptizing the baby. Wetting the baby's head means making use of some other spirit in order to celebrate the birth of one's newborn baby, i.e. one goes out and gets drunk. So have you ever heard that expression, wetting the baby's head?
No, I've not heard that, but that's a very interesting phrase. I've never heard that.
Yeah, that's an Irish expression. So wetting the baby's head. There's also another Irish expression known as the crack. So if an Irish person ever asks you for crack, do you have any crack? It doesn't mean what many Americans might think.
that doesn't sound very good.
Okay, but this is just something you will need to get used to. Anybody listening, just Google crack, C-R-A-I-C. Crack, what the Irish people mean by the crack, and you'll find out it doesn't mean what you think it means. Okay, so there's two Irish expressions you have there. Right. Anyway, Peter fathers James. James, he's in the hospital with mummy, they're recovering. So Peter goes out, decides to have several drinks. He tragically dies. Okay. James grows up without his father. So Peter's not there. James's father is not there. Okay. He's dead. He's gone. He's out of the picture. James grows up. He can still father John. Even though Peter isn't there, James can still bring about John. So that means that James can act as the cause of John without Peter even being there, without Peter even being in existence, which means that Peter isn't the cause of John. James is the cause of John. So why do I emphasize this point? I emphasize this point because in a per accidens causal chain, members of the chain only depend on their immediately prior members. So current members of the chain only depend on their previously prior members, and they only depend on them for their presence in the chain. But the chain of causes can keep going on because each member of the chain has the causality of the chain within itself. So in the cases of fathers and sons, each son is a biologically functioning male. He can produce his own son. He doesn't need the causal help of the previous member of the chain. So as each previous member drops away, a new one can come in. So you got a father produces a son, the father drops away, the son produces a son, he drops away, son produces a son, he drops away, and so on and so on and so on. As long as you always have a prior member, okay, in the chain, there's no problem with that chain going to infinity. As long as there's always a prior member in the chain, that chain of causes can be infinite. It's not actually infinite, all right? It's only ever actually finite because of the successiveness of the members in the chain. So if the fathers and sons, you have the father produces a son, father drops out, son produces a son drops out, and so on and so on. At any one point, it's only actually infinite, but it's potentially finite. That's per accidence causal series. But now let's jump over to per se causal series. Per se causal series are different. In a per se causal series, the members of the series don't possess the causality of the series in virtue of what they are, and so participate in something which does have the causality of the series in virtue of what it is. This is the originator of the causality in the series. So you take the mind or mental agent, moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone. What's the causality in that series? It's motion, mobility. So it's the mobility that the things in the series have. So the hand, the stick, and the stone, they don't possess motion in virtue of what they are as hands, sticks, and stones. They're immobile in virtue of being hands and sticks and stones. And so they require something to originate their motion. They participate in the motion in the series, which was originated by the mental agent. So you take somebody on the golf course, you take the golf player on the golf course. In my articles, I call him Dr. Smith. So Dr. Smith is on the golf course and, he's teeing up, and he's swinging his club, he moves his hands to swing the club to hit the ball. Okay. The hands, the club, and the ball, they would not move unless induced to move by Dr. Smith. So the causality that the hands, the stick, and the ball have is a participated or a derived causality, which they don't have essentially, and which they would not have were it not for Dr. Smith. They would be immobile. They would be without causality were it not for Dr. Smith. Okay? So if Dr. Smith didn't move his hands or the stick or the ball, they would be immobile unless some other cause came and did that. Another example here would be the fire heats the pot to heat the contents of the pot. The pot and the contents are not naturally heated in virtue of what they are. They don't have heat in virtue of what they are, but fire is something which heats in virtue of what it is. It's just something that fire does, given what it is. And so the pot and the contents of the pot participate in the heat from the fire. You take them away, the pot and the content of the pot immediately start to cool. So without a source of heat, the pot and the content of the pot are unheated, and they will not remain heated unless they remain with that source of heat. So that's per se causal series. Now notice something here in per se causal series. The primary cause in per se causal series, Dr. Smith moving his hands to move the stick to move the ball, to move the club to move the ball, sorry. Dr. Smith is the primary cause, not because he's first, not because he's just here and then everything follows from him. Rather, he's primary because in him, he possesses the causality of the series in himself. He is not dependent for the causality in that series. Okay? A mental agent is just able to originate motion. That's, one of the privileges of being a mental agent. Fire is able to originate heat. It's one of the privileges of being fire. Whereas the hand, the stick, and the stone, or the pot and the contents of the pot, they can't originate that causality in themselves in virtue of what they are. So they are secondary causes, and they participate in the primary cause for the causality that they have. That's what it is to be a primary cause in a per se ordered series. It's to possess the causality of the series essentially in virtue of what they are. Fire possesses heat essentially. Dr. Smith has motion essentially, or he's able to originate motion in virtue of what he is. Now this is important, and it's important to bear that in mind, that a primary cause in a per se ordered series isn't primary because it's first. It's primary because it possesses the causality of the series essentially. Now back to essence and existence. We have a problem. We have a real distinction between essence and existence. Okay? A thing cannot originate its own existence. It can't be the cause of its own existence. Okay? Because it didn't exist prior to its having existence to originate its own existence. So it gets its existence from an extrinsic principle. We now have a causal series set up because what's the extrinsic principle of my existence? Well, arguably my parents, the atmosphere, the physical laws, the universe, all these, different sort of causal inputs come in. But if you think about essence, existence, composites, they don't possess existence essentially in virtue of what they are. So if we take the causality of existence, it's a kind of causality which things have, but they don't have it in the way that the fathers and sons have the causality of paternity, because they have paternity in virtue of what they are. Peter, James, and John can bring about sons in virtue of being biological functioning males. So they have that causality essentially, but we don't have existence essentially. Anything which is multiple, anything except that, unique thing whose essence is its existence that we don't yet know exists, but anything other than that, okay, which is capable of being multiplied, is subject to distinction of essence and existence. And existence as a causal feature of things is not locatable within a per accidens ordered series, because the members of a per accidens ordered series have the causality essentially, but essence existence composites don't have existence essentially. So existence as a causal feature of things is locatable in a per se ordered series, like our mind, hand, stick, stone series. But what have we seen about that per se ordered series? If there is no primary cause which originates the causality of the series in which the members of the series participate for such causality, the members of the series would not have that causality. So unless Dr. Smith moved his hands to move the club, to move the ball, the hands and the club and the ball would be immobile. They would be lacking in that causality. So unless there is a primary cause for the existence that composites of essence and existence have, such composites of essence and existence wouldn't have existence. They would be lacking in that causality. So without a primary cause for the existence that essence and existence composites have, there would be nothing that exists. But things do exist, in which case there must be a primary cause for the existence that essence existence composites have. And as we saw from our consideration of per se ordered series, such is a primary cause because it possesses essentially the causality of the series. In this case, the causality is existence. So the primary cause of the existence of things is something that has existence essentially, i.e. something whose essence is its existence. So the primary cause of existence is that one unique, immaterial being that we considered in the second stage of argumentation, but we didn't yet know existed. We were just considering it hypothetically. We now know that that exists because were it not to exist, essence existence composites wouldn't have existence. And so it must exist in order for them to have their existence and participate in it for the existence that they have. And if God has been understood to be anything, God has been understood to be a single, unique, immaterial source of existence of all things. So God exists. So how's that, Jonathyn?
Oh, sorry, I muted my mic. I was going to say that was great, and I think this argument is always fascinating me because, for example, when people lay out, like when Phaser lays out the argument, what's called the argument from motion, it seems like the De Ente almost is like I don't want to say a better version, but it almost seems to get more at the heart of the issue of why things at any time they exist require a constant actualization. And that's because my essence, whether it's at T1 or T2 or when it first comes into existence, only gets its existence or has its existence or continues in existence contingently. So there needs to be something that's actualizing me and then actualizing my essence. And then you get into the causal series. So it would be correct to say that in a essentially ordered series, that the later members not only initially depend for their existence and their causality on the prior member, but they continually do throughout the time that they have such causality or have such actuality.
Yeah. So in the per se series, the primary cause isn't just the cause of the secondary members having that causality. The primary cause is the cause of that causality. So it's not just that, it gives them the causality and away you go and steps outside of the series. Were the primary cause not present to the members of the series, the members of the series just wouldn't have their causality. So it can't just give them causality and leave them to it, because they are essentially without that causality. So if Dr. Smith, swung the golf club to hit the ball, but as soon as he started his swing, as soon as he induced motion, let go of the club and stepped back, well, the motion of that series would be lost and some other primary cause would come in to take over, say gravity or some physical law, which would bring the club to the ground. So similarly then with existence, the metaphor that Thomas likes to use is the light of the sun standing in the light of the sun. And that's actually a metaphor that you get in the De Ente Essentia. That, we stand to existence the way we do, to the way the atmosphere does to the light of the sun, such that the atmosphere isn't illuminated in virtue of what it is. So unless, it stands, in a causal relationship or participates in the light of something else which can originate illumination, it simply will not be illuminated. You take away that source of illumination, then the atmosphere is unilluminated. And we know that every day, when the earth, rotates and turns away from the sun, nightfall descends. And so same with essence and existence, that essences, aren't neutral with regard to existence or non-existence. Essences are naturally nothing in themselves. They don't exist in virtue of what they are, and so they participate in the existence granted to them by the primary cause, in the same way that the atmosphere participates in the illumination from the sun.
Yeah, and another important clarification that you made already is that it's not necessarily a temporal priority, even though we think God is in some sense prior to the universe. Aquinas, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is happy to concede for the sake of argument that not only is the universe eternal, like it's, the universe has always existed. Is that correct? And he thinks the argument still works because it's not about that temporal priority.
Exactly. So that was that business about emphasizing that the primary cause just has the causality of the series in virtue of what it is. So in this case, God is primary, not because he's at first, not because he's prior to the Big Bang or anything like that. God is primary because he has the causality of existence in virtue of what he is, i.e. his essence is his existence. So Aquinas says, you can have an eternally created universe, a universe without a beginning. And the reason why he holds this is that time is just a measurement of the before and after in a process of change. So as long as you have changeable things, you have temporal things. So if there are only a finite number of temporal things in the past, then the universe had a beginning. But if there are an infinite number of temporal things in the past, then the universe didn't have a beginning. But all those temporal things, all those things that change, they're all composites of essence and existence. So all such things need to participate in the primary cause for their existence, precisely because they're secondary members of a per se ordered series. So even if the universe didn't have a beginning, it would still need a cause, precisely because nothing in the universe has its essence as identical to its existence.
So we've gotten to basically actus purus. We've gotten to a being who just is existence itself.
Yeah.
One of the objection, well, maybe not an objection, but maybe and I think in a recent Discord AMA, which was not that recent, like maybe a month or two ago, you were asked about this, and I think you gave a really good answer as to someone could be really puzzled by the idea of essence and existence being identical, not just for the reasons Kenny is, but they just think, well, like what are you even saying? Like, you know what I mean? Like they're kind of just bewildered at what you even mean when you say essence and existence are identical in this thing. Could you maybe flesh that out as best you can as to what that means?
Yeah. So, usually when people, the first thing I want to say is that if somebody says, I don't understand what you mean by essence and existence, and so I don't understand what you mean when you say that essence and existence are identical, I do have to ask, is that an argumentative ploy that one is making? Because a lot of the times, whenever you see argumentation occurring, somebody says, I don't understand what you mean by this, when really what they mean is, I actually disagree with you here, but they understand perfectly well. Now, let's set that aside. Okay, so let's assume somebody really doesn't know what we mean by essence and existence. If one doesn't understand what we mean by essence and existence, the first thing that I would ask is, well, look, what point of the metaphysics that we've, taken this time to lay out didn't make any sense? Okay. Being puzzled is one thing, but what aspect of that metaphysics just didn't make any sense? Was it that essence, is, the unity of the matter and form of the thing, and it's, the co-relative principle of potency to existence as a co-relative principle of actuality? Do we not understand the difference between existing and not existing, and that, existence is that act by which something is something rather than nothing? mean, because I would like to think that, understanding existence is that by which something is something rather than nothing is fairly, straightforward enough to understand. So is the puzzlement then the idea that, this is just not how I'm used to thinking about existence? And if that's the puzzlement, then my feeling is kind of like, okay, well, not being used to it, it's kind of breaking, various categories is not actually a critique. It's not. Right. It's not actually a problem, unless you can show me that there's something philosophically.
I see, and the reason I ask this is because I'll often have discussions with people, and sometimes people are genuinely confused by what I'm saying, so I try to clarify it. But other times I feel like, and this might be a more broad critique of like how people engage in philosophical argumentation, is they kind of, like you said, use, well, I just don't know what you mean. Like that just sounds like gibberish. Like the word they use, like gibberish. They'll say Thomistic gibberish, mysticism, whatever they say, as an argument, and it's like, that's not really an argument. I feel like these principles have been laid out pretty clearly, unless you're just telling me you can't comprehend what it's like to be God, which in that case, I mean, Thomas is going to be in agreement with you. Do you see where I'm coming from there?
Yeah. And I'm very familiar with, those two different types of engagement. On the one hand, you get the serious philosophical engagement where, somebody will say, okay, well, that's different. That's strange. But I will read the metaphysics. I will engage with it. And if there are any problems with the metaphysics that has been laid out, well, I will bring up a criticism. And then you will get substantive philosophical criticism, which just doesn't end with, I'm puzzled by that. That sounds weird. Being puzzled by somebody's position in philosophy is not an excuse not to engage with it and try to raise problems with it. I mean, we're all puzzled by reading Kant or Hegel or something like that. And then we sit and read it and we wrestle with it. And then
I'm puzzled by looking at William Lane Craig, but that's not an some of his points, so but that's not an argument against his views.
Yeah. So, I mean, substantive, sustained philosophical engagement moves beyond puzzlement and, says, well, look, this is what's generated my puzzlement. I don't think this or that or the other follows or makes sense. And then they can point out to me what doesn't make sense. On the other hand, you get what I don't think is, substantive philosophical engagement, which is more of that hand-waving stuff that you kind of mentioned, at the start of just saying, oh, well, this just is not
just gibberish, just mysticism.
It doesn't make sense. I mean, that's hardly a philosophical, approach. That's hardly a principled philosophical approach to take. But then there is a principled objection to this position, and it's that existence is the flimsiest and barest notion of all, because it's the widest in denotation and the least in connotation. Because it's distinct from essence, existence just applies to every essence that exists, but it has no content in and of itself. It's the essences that have content in and of themselves. So it's the essences which are really full and thick of connotation. Whereas existence only really has denotation. It doesn't have any sort of connotation. And the thing is, the problem with that is that its viewing existence is kind of like this layer of cling film that goes over the essences that exist and in some way, kind of instantiates them that way. In other words, it just sort of tops up some potentially existing essence with actual existence. And that's not how Thomas thinks about existence at all. Existence, or esse, is the act of all acts. It is the fullest, most fundamental metaphysical notion, and everything else is lesser than or secondary to it, because anything which exists is a manifestation of some form of existence. It's some way in which something could be. So the existence that the thing has accounts for all the actuality in the thing. Any actuality that the thing has is accounted for by its existence. So existence is greatest in both connotation and denotation. And so that sort of substantive philosophical objection, it's least in connotation, greatest in denotation. It is substantive, but I don't think, it applies to Thomas's account of existence.
Yeah, I think, that makes a lot of sense. And I think often you do get that kind of hand waving, which is why I kind of brought it up in the beginning. But maybe to get to actual criticisms, not just like incredulity that people have. One might say, okay, Gavin, I grant you that there is a being who is pure existence itself, pure actuality, that constantly
Mhm.
sustains the world in existence.
Mhm.
Well, from there, how do we get to a God that has intellect and will? How do we get to a God that
Yeah.
is loving or omniscient? Any of those
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
personal properties or mental properties. What
Yeah.
would be your general approach, or and Aquinas's general approach to answering about intellect and will?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. You just cut out a wee bit there at the end, but I got the gist of the question. So, Aquinas argues that once we have established the existence of something, we then need to consider the nature of its existence, how it exists, in order to consider its nature. So, what is the mode of its existing? Now, we already know the mode of the existence of God, something whose essence is its existence. So, any divine attributes that we come across, God will have in virtue of being pure existence itself. So Aquinas argues for a number of things about the divine nature, such as simplicity, immutability, eternity, all the rest. And he argues that God is all these things, not because they, signify distinct attributes in God, like distinct accidents in God, but rather that God is these things simply in virtue of being pure existence itself. So what it is to be pure existence itself is to be utterly simple, eternal, immutable, all the rest. Now we can, use distinct conceptual contents to signify this, that, or the other in God, but they refer to one and the same reality in God, that is his being pure existence itself. So that's that distinction in sense, identity, and reference. So morning star and evening star are distinct in sense, but they're identical in reference. And notice something here just before we get on to intellect, will, and all of that, that when two things are distinct in sense but identical in reference, it doesn't mean that the two senses are identical to each other. Okay? So the sense of morning star and the sense of evening star, they're not identical to each other, but they're identical to one and the same reality. So similarly, when we hold that all of God's divine attributes are identical to the same reality, which is God, that doesn't mean that the distinct senses of those divine attributes are identical to each other. Okay, it means they refer to one and the same reality, which is God as pure existence itself. So all of that is to say that the divine attributes, that which we attribute to God, are not synonymous with each other. Okay, so intellect and will, that's what you wanted to know about?
Yeah, specifically intellect and will, because that really is what makes a quote-unquote mental being, if you want to call it that, according to most people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so no problem. So intellect, let's think about intellect first. What is it to be intellectual? What is it to be intelligent? Well, to be intelligent is to be able to receive the forms of things distinct from oneself without becoming those things. To receive the forms of things distinct from oneself without becoming those things. So let's take a tree, okay? I can receive the form of a tree without becoming a tree because I'm intelligent, okay? So I can have that thought about a tree. I think about the tree by means of the form of the tree. I can think about an elephant. I can think about a giraffe. I can think about the planet. I can think about all sorts of things, but I don't become those things. Okay, and that's a mark of intelligence, being able to receive the forms of things distinct from oneself without becoming those things. So if I possess forms of things in me without ceasing to be the thing that I am, i.e., a rational animal, a human being, then I possess those forms intelligently. A tree, on the other hand, and I'm going to put myself out there, I've already said the cats and dogs aren't rational, unless they're demons or angels, right? A tree, I'm going to put myself out there, is not rational.
That might offend more people than the comment about dogs and cats.
Is that right? Okay.
Maybe, yeah.
Right. I don't mind getting slaughtered in the comments for that. I will defend that view that a tree is not rational. Okay. So a tree is not intelligent. Okay. So a tree, when it receives the form of something distinct from itself, ceases to be a tree and becomes the thing whose form it receives. So let's say a tree receives the form of a door or a table or a bed or something like that. Well, it's no longer a tree. It's been chopped down, cut up, and, made into these things. So things which aren't intelligent, they can't receive the forms of things distinct from themselves without becoming those things, whereas intelligent things can possess the forms of things distinct from themselves without becoming those things. God God is pure existence itself. Okay? Pure existence itself. So the existence of anything which exists or could possibly exist comes from him. Anything which has existence or could possibly have existence comes from God, because, the existence of all things derive from God, who is pure existence itself. Nothing would have existence were it not for pure existence itself. So that then means that every form of existence is contained primordially in God, who is pure existence itself. Because when God grants existence to things, he grants some form of existence. He brings about some form of existence. So in God, then, primordially, are contained all the forms of existence. But God is pure existence itself. And, we haven't got into simplicity and stuff, but as pure existence, he's pure actuality. So he has no potency. So he's not composite in any way. So in possessing primordially all the forms of existence, God doesn't cease being pure existence itself, in which case he possesses all the various forms of existence, not in a real way. He doesn't become all of the various things that could be, but in an intelligent fashion, because that's what it is to be intelligent, to possess the forms of things distinct from oneself without becoming those things. So God must be intelligent if he's able to possess all the forms of things distinct from himself without becoming them. So that's intelligence. And there's more that can be said on that, on the mode of God's intelligence, but that establishes intelligence.
One of the, and this, I think, relies on the principle of proportionate causality to some extent, that what's in the, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what's in the effect is somehow contained in the cause. Is that, and so the forms somehow exist in the primary cause?
To a certain extent. I know Fieser endorses principle of proportionate causality, and he talks about, the virtual containment of what's in the effect as being in the cause. You don't really get that sort of talk in Thomas, but Thomas does affirm that any actuality which is in the effect is derived from the cause. So the cause must be sufficient in actuality to bring about the actuality of the effect. And so if the actuality of the form is in the effect, then the cause must bring about the actuality of that form. And so the actuality of that form must at least be open to the power of the cause to bring about.
Right. And what I'm getting with this is it's an interesting objection I heard that I haven't really had enough time to I've thought about it and it kind of confuses me. Maybe if you've heard it, maybe you could give your response to it just by hearing it. I know we don't always have all the objections. So when Phaser talks about it, I'm just going to use Phaser as an example because I'm most familiar with how he categorizes this, is that there are three ways in which the effect can be contained in the cause. And one of them is having the power to produce the effect. So I might have the power to produce $20 and give it to somebody else. It doesn't mean I necessarily have $20 in my pocket, but I have the power. Maybe I know a politician who can give it to him or something. Yeah. And what if somebody tries to block the inference of the forms being present somehow in the primary cause in a mental way by saying, well, the primary cause doesn't necessarily have them in a mental way, but just has the power to produce the forms. And that's the way the effect is contained in the cause. And that to them might seem like a way of getting out of this being having an intellect. Do you kind of see what the objection is?
Yeah. So the way around that is that all possible forms are forms of existence. They're not forms of non-existence. If God is pure existence itself, as we've seen, then all forms are forms of pure existence itself. There's some instances or some imitations or similitudes of pure existence itself. God is pure existence itself, and all the various forms are forms of that. So they're all pre-contained in God, just as pure existence itself, but they're pre-contained in him without him being any one of those.
And it's not a mere like just having the power to produce it. It's actually being contained in the thing because of this sort of participationist picture.
Yeah. So God is known to have an intellect because of that. Now, the mode of God's knowledge, that's something different. And that's where we look at, God's power to produce all these things. because that'll help us depict the mode of God's knowledge. But affirming that God has knowledge doesn't require us to refer to his power. It just requires us to refer to him as being pure existence itself.
So it's really the participation, which seems very Neoplatonic, actually, this sort of participation in existence. Absolutely. In this case, it's going to help get the inference to a mind. It's not just the mere kind of principle proportionate causality or something like that. It's also, they're actually taking part in pure existence itself. So it would have to be something like a mental, or something like knowledge in God.
Absolutely. Yeah, precisely because they are all sort of participating in pure existence itself. So they're instances in a certain way. Thomas, in the commentary on the divine names, says there are certain similitudes of God's being, and elsewhere he talks about, creatures being similitudes of God's being. Well, so these forms as similitudes of God's being then are pre-contained primordially in God as pure existence. They're reflections, in a way, of pure existence itself. How they are reflections, then, that requires power and all of that. But insofar as they are reflections, they're pre-contained in God's being. And since, God's being is simple and doesn't change, it doesn't become any one of those things of which his being is the similitude. And so they're contained intellectually. And that's, as you say, Neoplatonic. That's in Plotinus, where you have the one and you have the nous, which reflects upon the one and understands all the ways in which the one could be understood. Now, Thomas, I don't think he had read any Plotinus. He had certainly had access to passages in various other sort of Neoplatonic works, but I don't think he had read directly Plotinus. So, but nevertheless, it is a very Neoplatonic sort of theme.
So I have one or two more questions about maybe the nature of God and divine simplicity, and then we have like two questions from the chat, one or two questions from the chat. Does that sound good? Then we can wrap it up.
Although we can still get onto the divine will.
That's right. You made me forget. Okay, yeah, divine will. How does that follow? Oh my gosh, I forgot about the most important part.
Yeah, we don't want to forget God's will. Right. Okay. So this actually, we haven't got into simplicity and goodness and stuff, but let's assume that we've established that God is good. Well, the reason why God is good, it's the Neoplatonic one again. It's that goodness is synonymous with actuality. This is because something is good insofar as it perfects a thing, and what perfects a thing grants to the thing something that it lacks. It gives some actuality to the thing that it lacks. So let's say, oh God, I mean, I haven't had a caffeinated coffee in a while. Okay, I had to stop drinking coffee for a bit. I was really getting, really bad reaction to the caffeine. I blame my wife. She got me the UK's strongest coffee on my birthday. It was killing me. So I say she got me coffee, tried to kill me. So I haven't had a coffee, and I see if I could just have a coffee, it would perfect me. Okay, I am lacking in caffeine, and I would love caffeine, and it would just, complete me. Okay. And we all know that sort of feeling. Okay. We all know some sort of goal or some sort of good, which will complete us in a certain way. It will bring about a certain actuality in us, which will complete us. And it is thus a good. Okay. So the good is synonymous with actuality. If God is pure existence itself, pure actuality, then he's pure goodness itself. Because the actuality of anything is dependent on God. So anything that, anything at all lacks is made up for in God's being, which is pure existence. And so God is pure goodness. So assuming that all that argumentation is in place, and we can revisit that if you like, God is pure goodness. Now, the mode of God's knowledge, we never really sort of got onto that, but briefly, God is intelligent because he possesses primordially the forms of anything which could possibly be. Now, how is it? What is the mode of God's knowledge? How does his intellect work? Usually with our intellects, we look around at things, we grasp some sort of conceptual content, and so we represent the thing conceptually to ourselves. So I see my trees out the front. Okay, I have some sort of conceptual content of the tree abstracted from the tree. And so by means of that intelligible species, the intelligible species is like the prism or like the glasses on your face by which you can see intellectually the tree. I understand and I can know the tree. What is the intelligible species by which God understands? What is the prism by which God understands? Well, it can't be anything distinct from God, because then he would be subject to something for his understanding. So it must be the divine essence itself. So God understands the divine essence itself, And in understanding the divine essence itself, understands everything that could be understood. He understands every possibility of being in understanding the divine essence itself. And this has really cool implications for creation and how, God's knowledge and will can remain the same while creatures can change, because God doesn't know creatures in terms of their various conceptual contents that he has in themselves. He's not like us, going out seeing things and abstracting conceptual contents, intelligible species from them. He knows them in virtue of his own essence. That's the prism by which he knows things. And since his own essence is immutable and necessary, okay, his knowledge is unchanging and necessary. So it's not, his knowledge is not contingent with the contingency of creatures, and it's not changing with the changeableness of creatures. So his immutable and necessary knowledge is the means by which he knows changing, mutable, contingent things. So that's one really cool thing. But what I want to get on to is with God's will. Right. The will, a thing has a will insofar as it understands, it appreciates something as good. So the example I always like to give is that, a scientist, or any of us, we see a bottle of water and we just think H2O, okay? Right? That's just a plain understanding of what water is. It's H2O. It's 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. So it's just a collection of H2O molecules. Okay. Now, let's say we're just out of the gym. I like to work out a lot. I like to train a lot. It's been warm over here in Ireland. We're in the sort of the mid-20s Celsius. So I think that's just over 70 Fahrenheit. So I don't know how Americans feel about that. But see, in Ireland, that's T-shirt weather. In fact, for a lot of people in Ireland, they go out without shirts on. I don't, but a lot of people in Ireland do that. But so, working out a lot, training, you see the water and, right, well, okay, that's water. But you don't just see it as water. You're like, oh, God, I'll be having some of that. Okay. So you're attracted to it because you see it as a good. All right. And so immediately your will desires that as a good. So once you understand something as a good, you desire it and will it. Okay. And that's what the will is. It's the intellectual appetite for the good. Now, God, in knowing, what is it that he knows? He knows the divine essence. Okay. That is the direct object of God's knowledge. But the divine essence, as pure existence itself, is pure goodness itself. So in knowing the divine essence perfectly, God knows the good perfectly. But what is it to know the good? It's to will the good. Whatever knows the good has an intellectual appetite for the good. Otherwise, it wouldn't understand it as good. If you see something as good, you will it. Otherwise, you're not seeing it as good. You don't see it as good, and thus you don't desire it. So you only desire the things that you see as and understand as good. Now, God sees and understands his divine essence as pure goodness itself, and so he wills the divine essence itself. And how do we treat things that we will desire as good? We value them. And what is it to value things? It's to love them as the goods that they are. So God understands the divine essence as pure goodness itself, and thus wills and loves the divine essence as goodness itself. And this has all sorts of implications for creation, because what it means is that when God undertakes to create, he does so out of the motivation of the love that he has for himself. Okay, so all creatures then are willed to exist precisely out of the love that God has for himself as the good itself. So creatures aren't necessary. Okay, God does have a motivation in creating, and that's the love that he has for himself. But no creature is necessary, because God can still love himself as the good that he is without creating. So they're non-necessary means by which God loves himself, which means that every creature then exists precisely because of God's love for himself. And that then means that insofar as God, as immutable and eternal, never stops loving himself, can never stop loving creatures. So the way I always like to put this, especially with regard to rational creatures, there's nothing that any creature could do, especially nothing that a rational creature could do, which could cause God to stop loving it.
That's amazing to me, because we often think that things in the Bible are things we can't know by natural reason, but that what you just described, you didn't make any reference to Scripture, and yet we got to the conclusion that St. Paul comes to in Romans 8, that nothing can separate us from the love of God.
Absolutely.
Nothing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that to me is amazing, because it's often thought that this Thomistic picture of God is kind of impersonal, but it seems like it's maximally personal in a sense.
Yeah. And I think that the problem with that, I think Eleanor Stump really put her finger on it, is that this focus on God as pure existence itself, okay, it sometimes takes people's attention away from God as an agent. God is pure existence itself, and in being pure existence itself, God is utterly unique. Okay, so God, in being utterly unique, is an individual, and so can be signified in the concrete as the individual that he is. But he's not an individual because he's individuated the way we are. He's an individual because there's nothing that is like to be God except by being God. And so God is an agent. And so God is an agent motivated by, the good and the love that he has for himself. And so this conception of God is deeply personal. Now, the slight bit where I would disagree with Stump is that I think focus on God as pure existence itself gets us to that personal agent. I don't think we kind of have to, maybe cast our attention away from God as pure existence itself. I think that gets us there. But I think, the people maybe outside of Thomism who just read pure existence itself all automatically think of like the force or energy.
I think it's like a blob of stuff.
Yeah. Which obviously isn't what it is. God, is pure existence itself, utterly unique, and so is an individual.
And also because obviously St. Augustine and St. Thomas picks up on this later in regards this a little bit to the Trinity, talks about how really the Trinity is the processions in God internally are that of intellect and will, and that's kind of what quote unquote generates the Son and the Spirit.
Yeah. So that's how. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
And I was just gonna say, and would you agree that is also that's intimately a part of how God knows and loves the divine essences in the three persons? What's the connection, you think?
Yeah. So those processions of intellect and will can help us to understand the Trinity of persons, because the movement of the intellect, generates the word. So whenever we have an intellectual understanding of something, traditionally, I mean, this goes right back to ancient philosophy. It generates, some sort of conceptual content, which the ancient philosophers called the word or the logos. And the reason why they called it a word is because by means of this conceptual content, we're able to form language. Our language has some sort of significance. So the words of our language are only have a secondary significance in relation to our conceptual content, which is the primary significance. And so it's the conceptual content which is primarily wordy, and spoken words just have their significance from that. So the intellectual understanding, it generates a word. Now in God understands the divine essence itself. So the generation of the word in God is a perfect manifestation of the divine essence to God. And then God, in understanding himself, through his word, there is the procession of the will, which is the love that God has for himself. And by a few twists and turns, that sets up the generation of the word, the Son, and the procession of the Holy Spirit. And the Son, as the word, is the perfect representation of God, and so the Son, as the incarnate word, represents is the manifestation and representation of God to humanity. There's also a mission of the Spirit as well, and that mission has a physical dimension, through the tongues of fire and dove and all that. But the word, reveals God to humanity. So that kind of gives you a model for understanding the Trinity. Although the Trinity is a revealed mystery, right, you could affirm the movement of intellect and will in God without affirming that these are persons, subsistent relations. So you could affirm all of that without affirming that these are persons.
Right.
But Scripture reveals that there are a trinity of persons in God, and so this neat sort of model allows us to understand how there could be a trinity. Yeah,
like it fit. I think they're called fittingness arguments. Like this really makes sense.
Yeah.
When we think about God being a loving or maximally loving, maximally knowing being, but it's not like necessarily logically entailed. That's something we get from divine revelation in Scripture, tradition, the church, and in our personal engagement with God.
Yeah. So this this philosophical model of God is demonstrable in itself. And then when we turn to the revelation of the Trinity of Persons, we see that Trinity can be understood on this model.
Are there, because I've seen, and I don't know how valid it is in the scholastic, and then we'll get to the questions about like the divine, more about divine simplicity and stuff, but this is kind of a question I just thought of, was when we talk about the incarnation, I've heard that there are like scholastic arguments for like not the necessity, but the high likelihood of the incarnation. Is that true, or are you aware of those arguments? Or
yeah, Anselm had an argument for the necessity of the incarnation. It's been a few years that I taught this stuff on Anselm, but yeah, Anselm argued that the incarnation was necessary. Something along the lines of, God's, utter goodness would have necessitated that he become incarnate. So, yeah, I mean, you do get that in Anselm. So Aquinas disagrees with that. Aquinas, holds, well, look, the incarnation wasn't necessary. So God can still be good and all of that without having to become incarnate. God opts to become incarnate, so as a rescue operation for sin. So there wasn't a necessity for God to become incarnate.
It's another one of those examples where it fits, but it's not necessary.
Yeah, right? Yeah. But I mean, there are a number of authors who do hold that even if Adam hadn't sinned, even if there was no sin, God still would have become incarnate anyway. That's a position, which is kind of aligned with the Franciscan tradition. The God would have become incarnate even if Adam hadn't sinned. Whereas the position aligned more with the Dominican tradition is that all we can really say about this is what Scripture tells us, and Scripture consistently tells us that the incarnation is a rescue operation for sin. So that's the most that we're able to affirm.
That's very interesting. And to get back to more of the divine simplicity and the stuff about the divine nature in relation to creation, there's a whole host of arguments called or objections called modal collapse objections, and there's been a lot of discussion about these because it has a lot of cost if these objections go through. It would these objections essentially argue, or the objection basically is that well, there's different versions, but one is if God's will is necessary, right, and God is omnipotent, so anything he wills comes about, well, then doesn't that mean creatures are necessary? And then there's the objection about there are obviously contingent things that God knows, but if God's knowledge of them is necessary, then they would seem to become necessary. So what would be the sketch of the responses to those two modal collapse objections?
Yeah. So first of all, with regard to the will, whatever God wills is necessary. Well, what does God will? He wills the divine essence. That's what he wills. That's what he can't fail to will, is the divine essence. Now, he can will the divine essence without, bringing creatures into existence. That's not a problem. So he's not necessitated in willing the divine essence to bring creatures into existence, since, he can do that without creatures existing. So the existence of creatures then is not necessitated by God's willing the divine essence. So creatures are contingent. They're non-necessary means by which God wills the divine essence, by means of which he wills his own goodness. So there are means by which God wills his goodness. In other words, he wills that creatures can enjoy his goodness, but they're not a necessary means because God can go on willing his divine goodness without the existence of creatures. So creatures exist because God wants them to exist, not because they have to exist.
In regards to the knowledge, and causality too, because I know William Matthews Grant, he has a dissertation on the free will defense, and he goes into God's causality, and also he goes into what's called an extrinsic model of divine foreknowledge, and obviously an extrinsic model of causality. And basically it's that God's knowledge of you consists in you being present to God's intellect, or you being, in the case of causality, it consists in you having a causal dependence on God. There's nothing intrinsic in God that would have changed if he didn't cause you. It's kind of indeterministic between God and creatures. Would you go with that kind of response generally?
Sort of. I read Grant's book, on the extrinsic model, and I know others who have read it, and they give it high praise. I need to give it time to kind of marinate and digest it a wee bit more, just to kind of see where I'm at with it. The way I would go with things, and some of this might align with Grant, and some of it might not explicitly align with Grant, is that what does God know? He knows the divine essence. That's that's the intelligible species by which he knows. And now that divine essence is necessary. What about the contingency of creatures? For Aquinas, the contingency of creatures is not located in God. It's not located in the fact that God could have known or willed things to be one way rather than the other. So it's not located in some change or some contingency that could have occurred in God. Rather, the contingency of creatures is something that God wills for creatures. So God wills that some creatures be contingent, and he wills that some creatures be necessary, in the same way as that he wills that some creatures be human and other creatures be non-human, or some creatures be, planets and other creatures be elements and stuff like that. In other words, the contingency of creatures is a feature of creatures. It's not a feature of God, and it's a feature of creatures that God wills creatures to have. So any modal features that creatures have are some features that God wills that they have. In which case, whenever God knows these modal features of creatures, it's not in virtue of that modality existing in, pre-existing in God. It's a feature of, what intelligible features, God chooses to give to creatures. Now, Scotus's view is different. Scotus holds that the contingency of creatures lies in the fact that God's will or God's knowledge could have been different. But Thomas's is not that. Thomas's is the view that God has simply willed these creatures to have the modality and the intelligible natures that they have. And so that doesn't require any kind of necessity from God's part.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And I generally accept what Grant says, but I do have some kind of, things I still have to, kind of like you said, like that I have to marinate over, because I have one or two maybe possible issues with it. But I definitely appreciate that answer. And I think the modal collapse objections, as Chris Tomaszewski points out, basically they really, if you take the principle behind the objections, they also apply to the non-classical theist or what are called the neoclassical theists or the theistic personalist. You just have to push the question back one stage, and it's the same objection. So it's really not a unique problem for Thomas or other classical theists.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So I suppose, my reaction to that would be, again, I don't go in for isms. So I'd like to know which non-classical theists, we have in mind, and, what their position is, and, then we can engage in that. But I suppose I would say for Thomas, you got a systematic metaphysics here, out of which he's working, and, out of which the answers to these problems emerge. So I don't tend to go for those sorts of retortion arguments. Well, look, if it's a problem for me, it's a problem for you. I tend to go, well, okay, you've raised this problem, so let's try and resolve it. And look, we have the resources here to resolve it. And if it's a problem for you, well, good luck in resolving it for yourself. I hope your position can do well. But I think Thomism has the resources to sort that out. Okay.
I think I'm going to go to, we have a few viewer questions, and then we can kind of wrap up. Let me go up to the cool. Top one, and I'll put it on the screen. Okay. Okay. This is one that was asked a while ago by Haley. She asked, Dr. Gaven, is rationality the only thing that differentiates us from animals of lower nature? Does charity or attachment also differentiate us?
So it depends on what you mean by charity or attachment. I don't take rationality in the very strict Enlightenment post-Cartesian sense. That's not what I take rationality to be. I take rationality, first of all, to be the ability to offer a reason for what you believe. So if you have a belief X, if somebody says, well, why do you believe X? You can say, I believe X because of X, Y, and Z, and that's your reasons. So that's a fundamental feature of rationality. It allows us to think about the world in a conceptual way And in thinking about the world in a conceptual way, we're able to give reasons for our beliefs. That being the case, then, if charity is, the love for the good and the willing of the good for others, and within a theological sense, the love of God, the love which unites us in friendship with God, then charity is part and parcel of our being rational, because to love others is to understand and to see them as the goods that they are. Every human being, as Kant argues, is to be treated as an end and never as a means to an end. And how do we treat ends? We value ends. We don't value the means to ends. So money, for example, we don't value money in itself. We value it for what it can bring us. If somebody hoards up money and never spends it, they've missed the point of what money is. So an end is something valued in itself, never as a means. And a human being is something valued as an end and thus loved as the good that the human being is. So every human being is to be loved for the subjects of value, the goods that they are. If that's what you mean by charity, and ultimately, loving God as the good itself, then that's just part and parcel of being rational, and that certainly does differentiate us from other lower animals. Attachment, I'd like to see maybe what you mean by attachment, but I suspect my answer would be along the same lines, that attachment is a peculiarly conceptual, rational affair that human beings have, which allows us to transcend the here and now and to attach ourselves to goods, which are goods in themselves, and ultimately to God, who is the good itself.
All right. Yeah, that was it. That was actually a question I was curious about when she first asked it. So that was a great answer. And the next one is about essences themselves. Cool. So he asks, Weinhold says, how could non-existent essences be? Don't we run into Eleatic paradoxes?
Yeah, lovely. So the Avicennian view, okay, Avicennian view, or the Latin Avicenna at least, which Thomas was familiar, held that essence sort of occupies this third, essence in itself occupies three different sort of roles. There is essence as it exists in the thing, essence as it exists in the mind that thinks it, and then essence as it exists in itself. So it's threefold sort of existence of essence. And so you can have non-existing essences, because you can have essences which neither exist in the mind or in the thing, but they're non-existing essences. And that kind of position is repeated later in the 19th century with the German philosopher Alexius Meinong, who held that, all objects exist, but some of them exist more than others. So you've got all objects that exist, but some of those objects, they don't just exist, they don't just have existence, they have Bestand. Or it might be the other way around, that they all have Bestand, but only some of them have existence. It's one or the other. The idea here is that all the various essences are real in some sort of way, but then some of them are topped up with even more reality, making them real. Okay, and that's always been a very sort of alluring position in the history of philosophy. Aquinas rejects it. So Aquinas holds that essences only exist either in the mind that thinks them or in the thing itself. Now, we can think about all sorts of non-existing essences. Okay, so that's our imagination can do that, but we can only do that insofar as we have engaged with the essences of existing things. We can throw them about in our minds, start to put them, diffuse them together, and start imagining non-existing essences. In other words, we can conjure up anything whose conceptual formulation doesn't apply a contradiction. And there you have, some sort of possible manifestation of being, which is what an essence is, some way in which something could be. But yeah, non-existent essences, they cannot be except for in some sort of mind that thinks them.
Right. So it depends on what sense we're talking about their existence.
Yeah.
Either in the mind or not.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
Weinhold again asks another good question. If God is the good in itself, how could he will anything other than himself? Okay.
So God is pure goodness itself. He wills necessarily himself, but he is the good himself. He is the good itself because he understands, himself perfectly as good. He wills the good itself because he understands himself perfectly as good, and he is the good because he is pure existence itself. Okay, wonderful. Now, in understanding himself as pure existence, he understands every possibility of pure existence. So he understands all the individual goods that would come about. And so how can God will those? Well, because he sees them as goods, and he, out of the motivation of the love that he has for himself, he wills some of them to be. So that's how, God can will them. That does raise all sorts of issues for what it is for God to be an agent and to engage in agency whilst remaining immutable. And, there's a, straightforward enough answer to that on the basis of analysis of intentional action. But in any case, that's how God, can will things other than himself, because he can understand all these various possibilities, which themselves are all goods and possible manifestations of the divine essence.
Do you think God has, and you think Aquinas would, what Molinus would refer to as middle knowledge, like what would happen in X scenario? Do you think God has that kind of knowledge as well?
No, I don't. So, so this is a little question of, free will, God's knowledge of free will, future contingents. So on the Molinist account, God would know what a free creature would do in any sort of situation that comes about, and that's how God is able to know what a free creature will do in the future, in some future point. That's the issue. Yeah. No. So I don't think Thomas is a Molinist, and I wouldn't be a Molinist either. So I hold that God is the cause not of a thing having existence. He is the cause of the existence of the thing. So at any moment at which a free creature exists, it is being caused to exist in all its actuality by God. So, and that includes all the actuality of the creature's intellect. It would not have the actuality that it has unless it participates in the existence granted to it by God. And because God knows everything which is subject to his power, he knows everything in the free creature which is subject to his power, including any decision or action that the free creature makes.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's another issue with Molinism and predestination that I still have to look into. For anyone who has any other last minute questions, put them in, because I don't want to keep Gavin too long. But I had a fun question that kind of related to the beginning. Since we said dogs and cats aren't rational earlier, do you think it's possible that there are dogs and cats in heaven, people's dogs and cats?
Oh, very good. Okay, well, so the soul is the form of the body. Okay, so there's an exhaustive distinction between animate things and inanimate things. So you have things which are animate and you have things which are inanimate, and there's an exhaustive distinction between the two. Now, what distinguishes them? It's not the matter or the bodies that they have, because they have that in common. We have our matter in common with inanimate things. So it's not in virtue of our matter that we're distinct from each other. So what distinguishes from each other? It's in virtue of how our matter is put together. So animate things have a special kind of form which informs their matter, which inanimate things don't have. And that form which informs their matter makes them animate. Aristotle called this souche, translated into Latin as anima, hence animate, translated into English as soul. So the soul is the form of the body, making the thing to be alive. All right. So it's the primary principle of life, of the thing. And there are three strata of life. There are things which are merely alive and can only take in nutrition, as plants. There are things which are not just merely alive and take in nutrition, but also engage in sensory movement within their environment, seek out a mate, all that sort of stuff. That's non-rational animals do that. And there's things which are not just merely alive and take in nutrition, which don't just move about in an environment, seek out a mate, shelter, all the rest, but also reason about the true and the good. And that's rational animals. They have a rational soul. So plants only have a nutritive soul. Animals have a sensitive soul. And rational animals have a rational soul. The rational soul has two powers to it, intellect and will. These powers don't depend on a material organ for their exercise. This is because the intellect stands in potency to all things intelligible. If it had the actuality of any material thing, it wouldn't stand in potency to knowing that material thing. But insofar as the intellect does stand in potency to all things intelligible, it can't have the actuality of any material thing, in which case the intellect itself is immaterial, Now, it's an immaterial power of the rational soul, and the will is the same, because the will is the intellectual desire for the good. And so the soul, whose powers they are then, must be immaterial. But the soul itself is not a substance. Okay, the soul, the soul in union with the body is the human substance. So the rational soul then, insofar as it's immaterial, its identity conditions don't depend on the identity conditions of the body, in which case its persistence conditions don't depend on the persistence conditions of the body. So the active existence of the substance as individuated to the individual human substance is an individual active existence in which the soul participates and in which the body participates. Now, when the body disintegrates at death, when the soul is separated from the body, the soul is not separated from its active existence. The body is separated from its active existence, but the soul isn't, because the soul is immaterial. So the soul continues to enjoy its individual active existence after death. It's the rational soul. And so in, subsisting beyond death, it can enjoy the vision of God. Being in the body as a result of original sin, we have a darkened intellect and a weakened will, and so we no longer enjoy communion with God. Being separated from the body, we can enjoy God's presence if our soul is in a certain state at the moment of death. And so we can enjoy that separated state of presence with God. And then when resurrected, when reunited with our bodies, our soul comes once again to inform our bodies. The glory that the soul enjoys through being in the presence of God filters down into the body and glorifies the body. And so in that resurrected state, enjoys beatitude, the presence of God, which Christ enjoyed here on earth. All that is to say that can only happen to something with a rational soul. That can't happen to anything with a non-rational soul, because non-rational souls are not immaterial and so don't subsist beyond death, in which case there will be no non-rational animals.
That was a very philosophical way of telling me that my dead cat's not going to heaven. No, I'm kidding. Okay.
So when the lion and the lamb sit down at peace, that's really to signify, that the lamb has conquered and there will be peace and all sin and every tear will be wiped away. But it doesn't mean there will be actual lions and lambs in heaven.
And that's the Thomistic understanding, and that makes sense to me too. Although I hope that God maybe miraculously sustains the forms apart from the matter or something of the animals.
Well, I mean, it'll be an adventure to find out anyway.
Definitely, I hope to find out. One more question Weinhold asked again. Bit of a technical question. Since things are defined by their quiddity, no buffaloes and wild or wildebeest or wild beast have the same essence. Or do buffaloes and wild beasts or wildebeest have the same essence, grazing animal? I don't know if I don't understand the question. Maybe you could unpack it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. So that pertains to, biological classification. Does a biological classification, give the real essence of the thing? Well, I mean, grazing animal, I mean, that wouldn't just apply to buffalo and wildebeest. That would apply, to different species of animal as well, such as, cows and, what other animals graze? Sheep, horses. I don't think grazing animal is specific enough. Rather, grazing is what some sort of species of animal do. Grazing is something that lots of different species of animal do. Indeed, we talk about humans grazing sometimes. There's some people that don't eat their 3 square meals a day, but they just graze throughout the day. I'm one of those people. I can't, stomach, a big meal. I would eat about 6 or 7 times a day. That's why I'm a hard gainer at the gym. So I don't think grazing is enough of a specifying feature to specify the genus animal. Rational extraterrestrials, would that make them the same species of us? This is a bit of an interesting question amongst some Thomists that I've spoken to, because I remember talking to a few Thomists and they hold, well, look, if the substantial form of the human body is the rational soul and the rational soul is immaterial, then if you have rational extraterrestrials, they have a rational soul, an immaterial rational soul. And so their substantial form is the same substantial form as ours. So despite differences in morphological features, which are accidental sort of, accruements, of an evolutionary process, the substantial form is still the same. And so any sort of morphological differences would be like morphological differences between human beings that we have now versus human beings that you had 10,000 or 20,000 years ago, who maybe weren't as tall or had different sizes of skulls, or, different sizes, of lung capacity or something like that. There would just be, accidental sort of differences as a result of evolution, but not, any sort of essential differences, in which case such extraterrestrials could be classified as the species human. I've heard some Thomists point that out. Now, that is highly speculative. The other way to go with that is that the rational soul would be the same, but the matter that it informs would be different. So the substance itself would be different. And so if you had a rational shark, let's say, it would not be of the same species as human, because the matter that it informs and its living conditions are different, even though both will be rational. So that's kind of, the two ways that you could go on that, both highly speculative. I was talking to somebody during the week on this, and, I said, look, we really wouldn't be able to, answer that question unless we, had the physical evidence, that we knew the physical history of the beings that we're being asked to consider.
And a short follow-up is, and this will be the last final question, what would be the difference then between, and this next one is between cattle, wildebeest, and buffaloes?
Yeah. So, I mean, that would just be, a biological question. What, in fact, the difference would be. How do biologists, distinguish between cattle, wildebeest, and buffaloes as the distinct species that they are? So there's some sort of principle of specification by which one is specified rather than the other. And whatever that is, that would be the specific difference. Otherwise, there is no specification between those. It would be the same, like horses, donkeys, whatever. There's some sort of principle of specification by which we distinguish one rather than the other. And, same with dogs and wolves. There's some principle of specification, and that's an empirical issue. What we can say as metaphysicians is that, once that empirical issue is resolved, we can say that's what the differentiating feature of the genus is, which specifies that species.
All right. Gavin, I want to thank you so much for coming on, because we've been here for about 2 hours, 21 minutes, and I think it's been very informative, and I think a lot of people are going to benefit from it. And I've certainly learned things that I had no idea before.
Okay.
Would you like to give a last plug to anything that's coming out in your work, where people can reach you if they want to ask you questions or just anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So as I say, I work at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. I teach philosophy there. That's in County Kildare. That's about 30 minutes outside of Dublin. So anybody wants to come and visit, and during non-COVID restrictions, you just get a plane into Dublin, and you can come to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. We're having a big conference next year, a big international conference next year. We've got about 20 speakers all together, major speakers, world-class, philosophers. Eleanor Stump is coming, Julia Klima is coming, John Canassis, Thomas Joseph White, Rowan Williams, William Desmond, Cyril O'Regan. All these high-class speakers are coming. So, and it's going to be on the future of Christian thinking. So it's going to be awesome. So, come along, and enjoy it, and, come to the conference. It's going to be at the end of April. We'll hang out, we'll have drinks, we'll get tattoos, we'll do martial arts, all of that. It'll be great crack. And we'll do a bit of philosophy as well. And so there's that. We have that coming up. In my own work, I've got a number of articles, forthcoming, just keep an eye out in all the usual sort of Thomist groups, or add me on Facebook, and, you'll see them being announced. They're all forthcoming, and, I'm constantly working on things, and they're coming out as well. Anybody wants to get in touch with me, you can get my staff profile on St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. You can add me on Facebook. I tend to respond to people. I tend to engage with people. I don't tend to get into an awful lot of discussion online on Facebook, because it tends to just to degenerate into a general back and forth, and there's not an awful lot of edifying, sort of discussion going on there. So I prefer to just keep things educational and not get into those debates, and leave debates for the journals, for the publications, and the academic conferences. But But yeah, I usually respond to private messages. If people want things clarified or want to engage in discussion, I'm happy to do that. Because it's less chance of it degenerating when it's private messages. So yeah, so check me out on Facebook, and you can, get my email address off the St. Patrick's College website. And, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, I have the 2 books with Oxford University Press. The first one is Aquinas' Way to God, and the second is Aquinas and the Metaphysics of Creation. And anybody who's interested, of doing a doctorate or some sort of postgraduate work in philosophy, and you're thinking you might like to come to me, to God help you, work with me and my colleagues, just, get in touch and I can tell you what we have to offer over here.
All right, that's awesome. I'm really looking forward, by the way, to the existential inertia paper.
All right.
So that'll be great to see. Guys, I'm going to put the links to Gavin's 2 books in the comment section after I go back and edit the video, and link to I'll try to find the website you're talking about, Gavin, and you guys can check him out there. Honestly, in my opinion, he's one of the best philosophers I see getting presented on YouTube. Him, Rob Coons, and all these other, even Thomistic. These guys are great, and so definitely keep up with their work. And Gavin, you said you're appearing on Swan Sona's channel on Friday or something like that, or soon. So
yeah.
We could see you there too.
So I'm on there on Friday night, 9:00 Irish time. I'll have just finished at Kung Fu. Kung Fu finishes around 8, and so I'll be in, and I'll be all battered and bruised and sore. So
that'll be the weak spot for Thomism.
Well, this will be it. So that'll be on Friday night then at 9:00. I'm appearing on Swan's channel. I'm also on the Pat Flynn show on Thursday night, where I think we're doing a roundtable with Jim Madden on realism, epistemology, that sort of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, that guys, definitely look out for this stuff, because as I say, whenever Gavin comes on, whenever I see a video from Gavin, I immediately click it and watch it.
Thank you.
But God bless you guys, and we're gonna end it here.
Thank you.